He thought the Apache girl just wanted to warm up in his tent, but not like that. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind hadn't let up for hours. It moved in sharp bursts down the canyon, tugging at the edges of Harlan Tate's canvas tent, whistling through the brush and bare mesquite branches outside. The fire he'd built before sundown was nearly gone now, only a bed of glowing coals under a half-collapsed rack of sticks. The pot of beans had long since cooled. The light from it barely touched the interior walls of the tent. Harlan sat with his back against the rear pole, hat pulled low, shoulders hunched inside his coat. The Henry rifle lay across his thighs, barrel pointing toward the flap. He wasn't tense, but he wasn't relaxed either. He'd spent too many years in too many camps like this to ever be fully off guard. The war had taught him that he'd left the army 4 years ago. Rode alone ever since. Trapping mules, trading hides, staying away from towns unless he needed bullets or beans. What he'd done during the campaigns still sat in his gut like spoiled meat. The villages they were ordered to burn. The screams. The silence afterward. And how he'd stood there, holding the line, pretending he wasn't watching what he was watching. Out here, he didn't have to answer for any of it. Didn't have to talk. That was the point, that he was chewing the last of a hard biscuit when the flap rustled. That IT wasn't loud. Just one sharp pull of wind and a hand. Maybe, but snapped his eyes open. His grip tightened on the rifle. He didn't move otherwise. Years of habit trained him to wait. One breath. Two. Then he saw her. A figure ducked low through the flap, paused, then took a single step inside. The light from the fire reached her legs first, bare, scratched, caked in dust. Then the wool blanket, wrapped crooked around her body, burned at one corner and soaked in ash. Her hair was black, tangled, stuck to her cheek with sweat or tears. She was shaking, but trying not to. Harlan didn't lower the rifle. Not yet. She said nothing. Didn't plead, didn't cry. Just stood there, half crouched, blanket clutched around her shoulders like it might fall off. Her eyes were wide, but dry. She looked exhausted. And she looked like she'd already decided this man might hurt her, but had nowhere else to go. That he kept watching her. Voice low, flat. "You alone?" She gave the smallest nod. Her chin trembled. "Campfire's out," he said. "You bring it with you?" Still no answer. Her eyes dropped, just for a second. Maybe shame. Maybe cold. Probably both. He lowered the rifle, but didn't set it down. He reached behind him and pulled out the spare blanket. Thin wool, torn at the hem, but better than the one she had. He held it out, but she didn't step forward. She just stared at his hand, her legs trembling now, either from cold or the effort of standing still. He dropped the blanket at her feet. After a moment, she bent down to pick it up. Her knees buckled slightly as she moved, and she let out a breath that sounded more like pain than relief. When she sat, she chose the far side of the fire pit, cross-legged, eyes down, wrapped in both blankets now. The tent flap fell closed behind her. He didn't speak again. Neither did she. The quiet was heavy, but not uncomfortable, just tense. Harlan leaned back again and watched her through the low firelight. She had to be Apache. Her face, her frame, the way she moved. But he didn't ask. Didn't need to. Not out here. Not after what he'd seen during the war. She looked young. Maybe mid-20s. Thin from hunger, but not sickly. Strong bones. Shoulders that had carried more than one winter. He noticed her feet again, split at the heel, bleeding in places. She'd come a long way barefoot. That meant she'd been desperate. Or chased. Or both. He knew what kind of things could send a woman like her running this deep into canyon country. Sometimes it was soldiers. Sometimes it was her own people. Sometimes it was worse. He pulled his coat tighter and stared into the coals. And words passed between them for the rest of the night. But something shifted. She didn't sleep, not at first. Just sat still, blanket tight around her, flinching at the snap of a log in the fire. She kept one hand tucked under the edge of the blanket, and he figured there might be a knife there. Good. That meant she wasn't completely helpless. When she did sleep, it was shallow. Restless. She curled in on herself like a child, feet tucked up, jaw clenched, shoulders trembling even under both blankets. She never turned her back to him. Not once. Harlan didn't sleep at all. His thoughts rolled like stones. Why had she come here, to this tent, out of all the ones that might have been left behind by hunters or scouts? Why now? Why him? He couldn't help wondering if maybe this was the war catching up to him. Not with bullets. With people. The fire burned low. He added 2 more sticks. Toward morning, she shifted in her sleep. The blanket slipped off one shoulder, and he saw the edge of a dark bruise across her collarbone. His jaw clenched. He didn't look away. She didn't stir. The sun came slow, pale through the canyon mist. When he finally stood, stretching his back with a quiet grunt, she flinched awake. Sat up fast, eyes wide again. Easy, he said, voice still low. Just feeding the stock. She didn't speak, but she didn't run either. He stepped out of the tent and into the wind. It was colder than before. He pulled on his gloves, adjusted the scarf around his neck, and walked toward the tethered mules. Behind him, he heard the tent flap shift, but not open. She was still there. That was enough for now. By midday, the sky had cleared just enough for pale sun to cut through the haze, casting a weak light over the canyon floor. Harlan knelt by the fire pit outside the tent, coaxing flame from a few dry twigs and strips of mule dung. He'd already hauled water from a creek and set beans to soak. Behind him, the girl still hadn't spoken, but she'd emerged, slow, hesitant, wrapped in the same blanket. Her feet were now wrapped in torn canvas he'd left out the night before, a crude attempt at shoes. She hadn't asked. She'd just taken them, which told him 2 things. She didn't expect kindness, and she didn't know what to do with it when it came. She squatted near the fire and held her hands over the heat. She didn't speak. Her eyes stayed down. Harlan didn't push. He didn't need to. He handed her a tin cup filled with weak coffee. She hesitated, then took it with both hands and drank slowly. She didn't thank him, but she didn't waste a drop either. That was enough. Harlan watched her movements, how she cradled the cup, how she glanced at his rifle resting beside the stump he used as a seat, how her shoulders tensed when the wind kicked up. She was used to danger. That was clear, but she hadn't run. Not in the night. Not at first light. That meant something too. "You got a name?" he asked. She didn't look at him, but after a pause, her lips moved. "Taya," she said quietly, almost like the word itself was fragile. He gave a single nod. "Harlan." She didn't repeat it, just tucked the name somewhere behind her eyes. He didn't ask more. He knew better than to pull stories from someone who didn't know him one. But there were things he needed to know. She was young, maybe 24, maybe younger, but her eyes looked older than his. That kind of weight didn't come from wandering. It came from being cast out. He hadn't seen tracks around the canyon for a week. No soldiers, no traders, no hunting parties. If her camp had been attacked, it wasn't recent. And if someone was still after her, she wouldn't have slept like she did. Not near the fire, not at all. Which meant she wasn't running anymore. Just drifting. After breakfast, he set about checking his traps. She followed him. He noticed it first by the crunch of gravel behind him, then by her shadow when the sun shifted. She kept her distance, but matched his pace. When he crouched beside a snare, she crouched nearby, watching but not interfering. One of the traps had caught a hare. Another held nothing but a broken twig. He reset both in silence. The 3rd trap. She stepped forward, motioning for his knife. He looked at her hand. Slim fingers, calloused palms, a few small scars along her wrist. Not soft, not careless. He handed over the blade. She crouched, cut the hair from the wire, cleaned it with quick, practiced movements, and wrapped the meat in a piece of canvas. When she handed back the knife, she met his eyes for the first time. There was no gratitude in the look, just a steady, searching gaze, like she was still deciding if he was safe enough to stay near. Back at camp, she skinned a rabbit and laid the hide flat on a rock without being asked. He noticed the way she worked, precise, methodical, the kind of skill passed down by necessity, not choice. She didn't move like a servant. She moved like someone who'd survived too much to be idle. Harlan patched a rip in his coat while she worked, but halfway through, the needle snapped. He cursed under his breath, dropped the fabric, and stood to check his kit for another. Taya stood, took the coat from where he left it, and sat with it in her lap. She pulled a small bone needle from a pouch beneath her blanket, threaded it with something she'd unwound from the hem, and began stitching the seam herself. She didn't ask. She just did it, and Harlan didn't stop her. That night, the fire burned longer. She cooked the rabbit with a few wild onions he'd pulled earlier. They ate in silence. She didn't touch his rifle. He didn't ask where she came from. But after they'd eaten, after he'd fed the mules and checked the perimeter one last time, she stood beside the fire and pointed to the sky. "Storm," she said. Duddy looked up. Clouds were gathering fast over the ridgeline. Wind had picked up again, colder this time. If snow came early, they'd be stuck for days. Duddy nodded, tossed 2 more logs on the fire, and ducked into the tent. She followed close behind, crouching low to avoid the flap. Once inside, she wrapped herself tight in both blankets again and sat near the fire pit, legs tucked close, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. He pulled off his coat and boots, laid the rifle beside him, and sat down with his back to the rear pole. They didn't speak again, but when the wind howled outside and the canvas groaned under the strain, she inched closer. Not enough to touch, just enough to feel the heat off his shoulder. She flinched when a gust slammed the flap, but didn't move away that he stayed still. Let her decide how close was safe. Let her draw the line. Later, when the fire died down and only a faint red glow lit the space between them, she lay on her side, head on her arm, eyes half closed. But before she drifted off, she whispered something so faint he barely heard it. "Why didn't you touch me the first night?" Harlan stared at the coals, jaw tight. He didn't speak right away. Then, quiet as the wind outside, he answered, "Because you didn't want me to." She didn't reply, just exhaled, slow and steady, and closed her eyes. And in the space between them, something settled that hadn't been there before. Not trust. Not yet, but something close. And for the first time in years, Harlan let himself close his eyes while someone else was still awake. Because he knew she wouldn't run. Not tonight. Not anymore. The storm came hard in the early hours. Not with snow like Taya had warned, but with sleet, sharp, frozen rain that hammered the canvas roof and soaked the ground outside into thick red mud. Wind pushed hard against the tent walls, making them sway and creak like an old barn about to give. Inside, the air was cold enough to see their breath. Taya had pulled the blankets tight around her and curled into a ball close to the fire pit. Harlan had fed the coals 3 times through the night just to keep the damp from settling in their bones. He didn't sleep much. Even when his eyes closed, his ears stayed sharp. Every gust of wind made him reach for the rifle beside him. Not because he thought someone was out there, but because some part of him always did. By morning, the ground outside had turned to mush. One of the mules had chewed through its tether during the night and wandered up the hill. Harlan found the tracks, cursed softly, and spent nearly 2 hours coaxing the animal back down the slope, his boots caked in freezing mud. When he returned, Taya had boiled water and was soaking a bundle of herbs in it. He didn't ask where she'd gotten them. He hadn't seen her leave camp. She must have collected them days earlier and kept them wrapped in her things. She offered him a cup. The taste was bitter and unfamiliar, but it cut the cold in his chest. He drank it all. Afterward, he set to sharpening his traps. She watched for a while, sitting near the fire, rubbing warmth back into her hands. Then, without a word, she picked up a length of rawhide cord and began repairing one of the broken snare loops he hadn't gotten to yet. Harlan paused, glanced over, then went back to his work. They didn't need to speak. That was becoming clear. Later that day, the storm moved off, leaving behind wet air and slick stone trails. Harlan considered packing up and heading south, closer to the winter trade routes near Dragoon Pass. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the weight of Taya's presence. Maybe it was the way she kept stitching his coat without being asked, or how she stirred the beans just enough to keep them from sticking to the pot. Small things, quiet things, but they added up. That afternoon, she finally told him what happened. They were sitting near the fire, Taya shaping a handful of soaked mesquite pods into a paste with the side of tin can. Her fingers moved slowly, eyes on the task. "My people," she began, voice low, "they say I bring misfortune." Harlan didn't look up from the rabbit he was cleaning, but he heard every word. "They said the sickness came because I stayed after the child died. They blamed the storm, the horses running off, the empty traps. They call me cursed." She paused. He still didn't look at her, just waited. They left me in the dry hills, with no shoes, no food. They took my brother. Her voice cracked then, barely. They said he'd be better without me. Harlan's jaw tightened. He finished cutting the rabbit and set the knife aside. "How old is he?" he asked. 7. He nodded once. "You know where they took him?" She shook her head. "I think a mission, near the trading post. They said the priest there takes and runs." Harlan let the words settle. He didn't say anything comforting. He didn't know how. But he looked at her then, really looked, and he saw something different in her face. Not fear, not sorrow, determination. That night, she didn't sleep curled in a ball. She lay beside him, under the same blanket, her back facing his chest, not touching, but close. He felt her breathing, slow, steady. And for the first time, she didn't flinch when the fire snapped or when the wind made the tent walls tremble. In the dark, he kept his eyes open and stared at the canvas ceiling. He thought about the mission near the post. He'd passed through there once, months ago. A white-walled church, faded cross, children with shaved heads and blank stares. He remembered the priest's voice, too smooth. He remembered the way the man had looked at the Apache boys like they were stray dogs he was training, that he hadn't liked it then. He liked it less now that he didn't say it, but the decision was made that if the boy was there, he'd find him. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, just because it was the right damn thing to do. The next morning, he handed Taya a pair of his thick wool socks and told her to pack light. They'd move out after breakfast. She looked at him for a long time, not questioning, not thanking, just seeing him, and then she nodded. Not a girl anymore, not a guest, but a woman beside him. And maybe by the time this was done, they'd be something like family. Not by blood, but by staying. They broke camp before sunrise. Harlan didn't speak much. He rarely did. But his movements were firm, focused, the kind of quiet that meant a decision had been made and wouldn't be unmade. He packed only what they needed. Dried beans, coffee, flint, the traps he hadn't had time to reset, his rifle, and the last of the rabbit meat wrapped in cloth. Taya rolled the canvas tight and secured it with rope while he cinched down the mule packs. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. He'd said enough by saying they were moving. The trail south toward the mission trading post was rough, not a path so much as a memory of one. Game trails split and faded into brush, and the rock underfoot was slick from the storm. Harlan walked ahead, leading the mules by their reins. Taya followed close behind, her feet wrapped now in the patched leather moccasins he'd dug out of his pack the night before. They were too big, but she didn't complain. By mid-morning the sky cleared, and the sun pushed through in cold light, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. A hawk circled overhead. Harlan stopped once, listened, then turned west off the trail. They crossed a dry wash and climbed a low ridge to avoid a fallen cottonwood. When they reached the crest, the land opened wide below, flat basin country stretching south, broken only by distant cottonwoods and a thin plume of smoke far off near the horizon. The mission, they didn't talk about what would happen there. Not yet, but the weight of it rode with them. By evening, they reached an old line shack, half collapsed but dry. Harlan tied the mules to a pinyon root and started a fire inside using branches torn from the broken roof. Taya sorted their supplies while he cleaned the last of the snare wire. When the fire caught strong, she took a seat beside it, legs folded under her, the lines in her face softening for the first time in days. "Why do you help me?" she asked, voice low, but not timid. Harlan didn't answer right away. He was checking the stock on his Henry, fingers tracing the crack along the grip. "Would have helped anyone in that storm," he said. She tilted her head, unconvinced. "Not the first night." He looked up then, not at her, but at the space beside her. His jaw tightened. "I've been around enough camps to know the difference between a woman asking for shelter and one expecting to be taken." He said it without anger, just plain truth. Taya looked at the fire. "You didn't ask anything of me. You still don't." Harlan gave a small shrug. "Don't mean I'm good." "You're not bad," she said. He didn't reply. He just went back to the rifle. Later, after they ate, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small bundle of cloth. Inside was a carved bone token, an Apache sign worn with time. She handed it to him. "My brother carved this before they took him," she said. "If the priest still has him, he'll recognize it." Harlan turned it over in his hand. It was simple, a circle with a split at the top, symbol for a hawk cry. He nodded once and tucked it into his pocket. That night, as the fire dimmed, she sat closer to him than before, not touching, but near enough that he could hear her breath, steady and deep. She didn't flinch when he pulled the blanket over both of them. Her head rested against his shoulder, and for a long time, they said nothing, but in that quiet, the air between them changed. There was no urgency, no expectation, just the silent agreement of two people choosing the same direction. WY morning, they were moving again. The land flattened as they neared the mission, sagebrush and dust giving way to worn wagon ruts and split-rail fences long since weathered gray. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. Harlan slowed his pace. Taya's face had gone tight. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. "We go in together," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "All right, but if he sees me and tries to take me back, he won't," Harlan said, calm but final. They reached the edge of the mission just as the bell rang for the midday meal. The courtyard was crowded. Half-starved boys herded by an older woman with a switch, a drunk trader asleep under his wagon, and the priest standing near the well, sleeves rolled, speaking to one of the townsmen. Harlan stepped forward, slow and steady. His rifle was slung across his back, but visible. His boots echoed across the packed dirt as he approached. The priest turned. He was younger than Harlan remembered, slick hair, clean coat, and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you, friend?" the man asked, voice soft. "I'm looking for a boy," Harlan said. "Apache. Name's Kolo. About 7. Might have come through a few weeks back." The priest raised an eyebrow. "We've taken many orphans here. I need to check the rolls." Taya stepped forward then. She didn't say a word, just held up the bone token. The priest's face flickered. Then he forced a smile. That one. Yes, he's here." Harlan's jaw tightened. "Bring him." Perhaps we could speak in my office now," Harlan said, voice low and flat. There was something in the way he said it, something cold, final, that made the priest hesitate. He nodded, turned, and called out. A moment later, a small boy was led out by another woman. His clothes were clean, but hung loose on him. His hair had been cut short, but his face was Taya's. Same sharp jaw, same dark eyes. When he saw her, he froze. Then he ran. Taya dropped to her knees and caught him in her arms. He was crying. She was too. Not loud, just quiet gasps muffled against his shoulder. Harlan looked away, gave them the moment. The priest cleared his throat. "You can't just take him. There are papers, custody rules." Harlan turned back to him. "Step close. He's not yours," he said. "And you think he's yours?" Harlan didn't answer. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded paper, and handed it over. The priest opened it. It was a legal trade permit from the Army Southern District, signed by a quartermaster Harlan had served under. It wasn't custody, but it gave him authority to relocate any tribal youth for protection purposes. It was enough to scare the priest that he stepped back. "Fine, but he's your responsibility now." Harlan didn't respond, just turned and walked back toward the gate. Behind him, Taya followed, carrying her brother in her arms. They didn't speak until they were clear of the mission walls. Then, breathless, she said, "You didn't have to do that." Harlan kept walking. "Yeah," he said, "I did, because the past didn't fix itself. You had to choose to do better, and he'd made his choice." The air shifted as soon as they left the mission grounds. It wasn't the weather, it was the silence. That heavy kind of quiet that settles in after a choice has been made and the weight of it hasn't caught up yet. The boy, Kolo, had stopped crying, but he clung to Taya's side like a vine to stone, one hand tangled in her sleeve, the other still clutching the carved token he hadn't let go of since she gave it back. Harlan walked a few steps ahead, eyes scanning the horizon out of habit, boots cutting a slow rhythm through the dry grass. He didn't speak. His thoughts were loud enough. He kept seeing the priest's face, that mix of arrogance and fear. He didn't like that kind of man, one who used peace as a mask for control. That boy hadn't just been kept there. He'd been molded, shaped, his hair chopped short, language gone, clothes too clean, soul bent. They made camp an hour before sundown, near a dry arroyo lined with mesquite. The shelter was simple, just canvas draped over two tied mules and pinned with rocks. Taya started the fire while Harlan scouted a perimeter. He set two snares even though he didn't expect anything to walk into them. It was just routine, and routine calmed him. When he returned, Taya was mashing beans in the pot with the back of a spoon while Kolo sat across from her, wide-eyed, his knees pulled up to his chest. He hadn't said a word since the mission, but he watched everything. Is he always that quiet? Harlan asked as he set his rifle down. Taya glanced at her brother. He used to talk. He'll come back to it. He remember you? She nodded. They told him I was dead. Harlan didn't comment on that. Just sat down near the fire and poured himself some coffee. Kolo stared at him, unblinking. After a minute, the boy finally spoke, voice hoarse and unsure. Are you the soldier? Harlan looked up. Taya stiffened. Harlan nodded slowly. Was. Not anymore. The boy didn't answer, just kept staring at the rifle leaning beside him. You afraid of me? Harlan asked, plain and direct. Kolo didn't respond, but his eyes dropped, and he leaned a little closer to his sister. Taya reached over and rested a hand on his head. He doesn't need to be afraid, she said softly. You didn't hurt anyone today. You did the opposite. Harlan didn't know what to do with that, so he just nodded once and stirred the fire. After they ate, Taya began brushing dirt from Kolo's feet, wiping the soles with the edge of her blanket. Harlan watched the tenderness in her movements, the patience. She talked to him softly in their own tongue, and the boy leaned in her like he'd finally remembered what safety felt like. When Kolo fell asleep, curled beside her on the blanket, Taya looked up. You could have walked away, she said. Harlan didn't pretend not to understand. I could have, but you didn't. He poked at the coals. Sometimes you don't walk because the road back's worse. She watched him for a long moment. Then quietly, you've done things? He didn't answer right away. Things I don't talk about. I know what kind of things, she said, not accusing. Just knowing. I saw soldiers burn our storehouse. Shot a man for running back inside to grab corn. I was hiding behind a woodpile. I was 8. Harlan looked at her then, not in pity, just seeing her, understanding. I was there, he said. Not at that one, but others. Taya nodded. You didn't have to say it. I did. She shifted, sitting a little closer now. Her voice dropped. My people saw what happened to me, and said it was because I'd been spared, because I should have died like the rest, and living meant the spirits had turned on me. He watched the firelight flicker on her face. That why they left you? She nodded once. They said I carried the shadow of the dead. Silence stretched again. But this one wasn't heavy. It was shared. You don't, he said simply. She looked at him, eyes catching his. You carry your own weight. Same as I do. For a long time, she didn't blink. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched the edge of his sleeve. Just the fabric. Nothing more. You think we can make something here? She asked. After what we both are. We already are, he said. We just haven't said it out loud yet. That night, she curled beside him again, but this time not because of the cold. He didn't reach for her, didn't pull her in, but he didn't move away either. Her breath warmed his chest, and her hand stayed resting near his collarbone. Outside, the canyon wind had finally settled. Kolo didn't cry in his sleep. And Harlan, for the first time in years, didn't dream of fire. They rode slow the next morning, not out of caution, but because neither of them said where they were headed. There was no longer a need for rushing. The boy was with them now, clinging to his sister's waist on the back of the pack mule. His head leaned against her spine, eyes half closed, small hands gripping her belt with the trust of a child who had known abandonment and recognized safety when it finally returned. Harlan walked beside them, reins in one hand, his Henry slung across his back. His boots stirred dust from the canyon floor as they crossed the narrow gulch west of the dry wash, the same path he'd used months ago when trapping alone. It looked different now, less empty. They set up camp before sundown under a ledge where the wind broke clean across the top. It was a place he remembered, dry, with enough brush for cover and a natural fire pit surrounded by flat stone. Harlan cleared it out while Taya unpacked. Kolo gathered twigs without being told. The boy still didn't speak much, but he followed instructions, watched everything closely, and stayed near his sister's shadow. After supper, while the fire crackled low, Taya pulled the rabbit bones from the pot and handed Harlan his portion. He accepted it with a nod, noticing the way her hands moved, more confident now. Like this wasn't survival anymore. It was routine, life. They ate in silence for a while, until Taya looked across the flames at him. "Why here?" she asked. "This canyon. This place." Harlan wiped his hands on a scrap of cloth, tossed the bones into the fire. "It's quiet, doesn't ask much from a man, and nobody comes unless they're looking for something." She held his eyes a moment. "What were you looking for?" He didn't answer right away, just stared into the flames. Then finally, somewhere I didn't have to answer for things anymore. Taya didn't argue. She didn't soften it with words, just gave the truth back in kind. "That's what I was looking for too," she said. After Kolo fell asleep, curled in the thick blanket with his feet tucked under the saddlebag, Harlan sat sharpening his blade by firelight while Taya braided her hair down over one shoulder. It was the first time she'd done that in front of him. Before, she always kept it loose or tangled, unkept like someone unsure if they'd last another day. She watched him for a moment, then spoke again, voice quieter now. "You still carry it with you. What you did in the war." He didn't look up from the blade. "It's not something you lay down. Not all the way. Then what do you do with it?" "Try not to be that man anymore," he said. "And if I can't fix what I did, I can at least stop it from happening again." Taya nodded slowly. "You already have." He looked up at her then. "You saying that matters." She reached into the pouch she kept tied at her hip, pulled out a small needle and a bit of frayed thread. "Your coat's still coming apart," she said. Gesturing toward the rip near his elbow, he shrugged it off and handed it to her. She took it gently and began to mend the seam, stitching in silence. The fire snapped once, sending sparks into the dark. When she finished, she folded the coat neatly and held it out, but didn't let go right away. "I know you didn't ask for this," she said. "Me. Kolo. Any of it. I didn't ask for a lot of things," Harlan said. "But that don't mean I don't want them now." The way she looked at him then, steady, unblinking, it was the closest thing to a question he'd ever seen in her eyes that he answered by scooting closer, closing the space between them slowly. Not to crowd her, just to be near. She didn't move away. Her hand stayed on the coat, now resting between them. Her fingers brushed his. He let the silence speak first. Then, low and even, he said, "If you stay, I'll build something better than canvas and coals. I'll find wood, raise walls, put a roof over your heads." Taya's voice was steady. "And if I stay, I cook every morning. I make medicine when Kolo coughs. And I sleep beside you because I choose to." He swallowed hard, eyes still locked on hers. "Then I want you to." She nodded, then leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder. Her hair fell across his chest. He didn't move for a long time. Just let her be there. Outside, the wind shifted again, softer this time. The desert around them was silent. Not empty, just watching. Later, when they lay down, Taya tucked herself against his chest, her arm draped across his ribs. Kolo, half asleep, curled closer too, one small hand resting on Harlan's boot like a child claiming territory. That night, there was no need to keep watch. There was nothing to run from, and nowhere else to be. They moved deeper into the canyon the next morning. The old trail narrowed between sloped rock faces and brush thick with rabbit tracks. But Harlan knew a place. An abandoned line station tucked against the rock wall, forgotten after the last cavalry patrols faded out years back. The roof had collapsed, and half the log wall was missing, but the stone foundation held. Water was nearby. Firewood was plenty. He figured it could be something again that IT was the first time he'd returned since the war. Back then, he'd use it to sleep between orders. Now, he was coming back with something else in mind. He stopped the mule at the ridge and looked down at the clearing. Taya stepped beside him, Kolo holding her hand. The boy had warmed some, speaking in soft whispers to his sister, even answering Harlan in quiet nods. But he stayed close. Always close. Taya followed Harlan's gaze across the clearing. "This is where you want to build it." He nodded. Enough stone left to frame out a wall. Roof will take time, but it's a start. She didn't question it. Just said, then we'll need to dry meat while it's still warm out. That was it. No ceremony. No speech. Just shared purpose. They unpacked everything by noon. Kolo carried stones from the old pit to mark a cooking ring. Taya set up the canvas as a shade lean-to, while Harlan started digging out what would become the new root cellar. They worked until sundown. No complaints. No wasted movements. Every task, no matter how small, was part of building something that might last. That be by the end of the second day. They'd raised a frame of upright logs, braced with rope and stone. Taya boiled strips of sinew to bind the beams. Kolo helped press clay between cracks in the wall to keep the wind out. Harlan worked until his hands bled. That night, while the fire warmed the clearing, they sat close and watched the shadows dance across the half-built walls. This feel like home? Taya asked, brushing with shavings off her skirt. Harlan didn't answer right away. Feels like a place that could be. Better than canvas. He nodded. Better than running. Kolo had fallen asleep nearby, wrapped tight in one of the wool blankets, his head resting on a folded sack of beans. Taya shifted closer, arms crossed against the chill. You know, she said quietly, when I was little, I used to think a man could never belong to the land unless he was born on it. And now I think belonging is something you build, not something you're given. Harlan reached for her hand without saying anything. She let him. They sat like that for a long while, fingers laced, backs resting against the new wall. The stars were out, clear and sharp overhead. The canyon wind had died down again. It felt like the land was breathing softer now. The next morning, he found Kolo stacking rocks into a circle and trying to shape a chimney with twigs. When Harlan walked past, the boy looked up. Is this ours now? Kolo asked. Harlan crouched beside him, watched the small hands place a flat stone on top. It is if we keep working at it. Taya stepped into view, carrying a basket of wild onions and mesquite pods. She smiled faintly. Then we better not stop. By the end of the week, they had 4 walls. No door yet, but the wind didn't bite as hard anymore. Inside, there was a place to sleep, a corner for food, and a small spot where Kolo had arranged 2 stones and a stick like it might someday become a table. That night, the boy asked if he could sleep closer to Harlan. Not out of fear, but comfort. Taya watched, and her voice was gentle when she spoke. You gave him that, she said. What? The steadiness. Harlan didn't reply, just pulled the blanket tighter around the boy's shoulder and let him sleep. When Taya lay beside him later, her voice barely a breath against his chest, she said, Do you ever wonder why it had to be us? No, he answered. I only care that it is. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just trying to forget the man he'd been, he was trying to become someone worth staying for. The days turned colder as the wind shifted out of the north. Frost laced the brush each morning, and their breaths hung in the air long after sunrise. The new walls of the shelter held the wind out, but not the cold, so they kept the fire going nearly day and night. Kolo started waking early without being called, collecting kindling, shaking the frost off the canvas, feeding the flames like it was his job. No one told him to. He just did it. That they'd built something by now. Not just a shelter, a rhythm. Taya had started planting winter onions in the soft patch of ground near the west wall where the sun lingered longest. She said if they made it through winter, the land would give more come spring. Harlan had scouted deeper into the ridge and found pine for beams, a frozen creek for ice, and a fox den to stay away from. He was always moving, always fixing, patching, hammering. But at night he was still. Beside her, that closeness had changed too. They no longer laid down like strangers keeping warm. No more silent inches between them. He would rest with his arm under her neck, her hand across his ribs, her breath warm against the underside of his jaw. It wasn't lust, wasn't ownership. It was choosing to stay near, because being near had begun to mean something more than surviving. That night, after they'd eaten, Harlan checked the doorframe again. It was crude, braced with uneven wood and a rusted hinge he'd salvaged from a wagon axle, but it held. Inside, Kolo was asleep already, curled near the fire, one hand tucked under his head. Taya stepped behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. You're always working, she said quietly. Still things to do, he replied without turning. I know, she whispered, but I want to talk before it gets too dark. He turned, let her arms guide him back into the warmth of the shelter. Inside, they sat close by the fire, knees touching. Taya's eyes stayed steady on his. Do you know, she said softly, the first night I walked in your tent, I thought I'd have to trade myself just to not freeze to death? Harlan's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. I didn't think you'd let me stay without wanting something. He looked at her then. I remember. She nodded. But you didn't. Not once. I wouldn't have taken anything you didn't give. Taya's voice was lower now, breath warm against his cheek. I know. That's why I'm giving it now. Her hand rose to his face, fingers brushing his stubble, eyes searching his. She kissed him once, soft, sure, and without hesitation. It wasn't quick. It wasn't careful. It was the kind of kiss that said, I've watched you long enough to know what kind of man you are, and he kissed her back the only way he knew how, steady, real, without rush or apology. When they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his. I don't want to survive you, she whispered. I want to stay. He pulled her in close, arms wrapping around her like she was something he'd carried too long just to set down now. You're not going anywhere, he said. Outside, the wind blew low through the canyon brush, but it didn't touch the fire. Not inside their walls. Not where it mattered. Later, when she laid her head on his chest and they curled together under the blanket, he didn't reach for his rifle. For the first time since the war, he slept without fear someone would take what mattered from him. And in the dark, just before her breathing evened out, Teo whispered one more thing. You don't owe me anything, Harlan. But I'm yours now. He didn't answer with words that he just stayed. Because sometimes love doesn't speak. It just doesn't leave. The winter came in slow, then all at once. First it was just the mornings, white frost on the rocks, a harder bite in the wind. Then came the real cold. Thick air, sky like slate. Snow fell across the canyon in uneven sheets, sticking to the edges of the shelter, gathering along the high stone ledges until even the pines looked bent from the weight. But the three of them stayed warm. The cabin wasn't finished, not by most folks' standards, but it stood solid now. Harlan had reinforced the roof with timber crossbeams. Taya had stuffed the walls with moss and woven reeds for insulation. They dug a channel to keep runoff from flooding the sleeping space. Kolo helped stack drywood in neat rows behind the shelter. It wasn't pretty, but it held. Inside, the air stayed warm. The fire never went out. The bedroll was shared now, without hesitation, and every night ended the same, with Taya curled under Harlan's arm, Kolo tucked close at their feet, and the wind rattling harmlessly beyond the walls. There was no talk of leaving anymore on the third morning after the first full snow. Harlan stepped outside with his coat collar pulled high, boots crunching through the white crust. He scanned the ridge for tracks, deer, maybe fox. The snares had come up empty for days. They needed more meat soon. But he wasn't worried. For the first time in years, he felt something solid under his feet. Not just the land, this life, this place, the cabin. He turned when he heard the door creak behind him. Taya stepped out, wrapped in his old cavalry coat, the sleeves hanging past her fingers. Her breath came out in mist. Her cheeks were pink from the warmth of the fire, not cold. You checking the traps? She asked. Later, he said. Snow's too fresh. Nothing's moved yet. She stepped beside him, leaning slightly into his side. They stood like that a moment, watching the quiet canyon. I had a dream last night, she said softly. I was back in the old village. Same faces, same whispers, but I didn't care anymore. I had something they didn't. He looked down at her. What's that? She smiled faintly. A door that closed behind me. A fire I could call mine. You. He let out a slow breath, shifted his hand to hers, and held it firm. Inside, Kolo stirred from sleep. They heard him rustling under the blanket. Then his small voice called out, Is it morning? Taya turned. It is. Harlan gave her hand one last squeeze before stepping inside. By midday, they were working together again. Harlan was splitting logs near the back wall, while Taya boiled a stew of root vegetables and dried squirrel meat. Kolo stacked kindling under the lean-to and sorted stones for the fire ring. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs later, While Taya mended one of Kolo's shirts near the fire, Harlan reached into his kit and pulled out a folded piece of hide he'd carved days earlier when no one was looking. He ran his thumb over the etched lines one last time, then walked over and handed it to her. She opened it slowly. It was a nameplate, smooth leather, pressed with careful lettering. Taya. Kolo. Tate. Her eyes didn't move at first. She just stared at the words. Then her fingers shook slightly. She looked up at him, unsure. You can keep your name, he said. But if you want mine, it's yours. She set the needle down, stood slowly, and stepped into his arms. She didn't cry, just held him tighter than she ever had. Kolo looked up from his stones. Does that mean she's your wife now? Harlan looked down at her. If she wants to be, Taya answered without looking away from him. I already was. Since the day you didn't ask anything from me. That night, they laid side by side under a roof Harlan built, beneath a blanket Taya had sewn, with a fire Kolo helped keep burning. There was no fear anymore. No waiting for someone to come take it all away. There was just the sound of wind outside and the breath of three people sleeping close, not because they had to, but because they'd chosen to, and in the morning, they'd wait till another day of building together.